the anarchist analysis of Irish republicanism. We should support the independence of Northern Ireland and to become a united Ireland with the rest of the island. But to understand, it's like we have to understand the origins of republicanism of Irish characteristics. And under anarchist principles, they're just very bourgeois Marxists, right? But to understand the edge fruit with an excellent analysis of the history of Irish republicanism, but we're going to focus mostly about the origins. The 1798 rebellion and the origins of Irish republicanism. On the 23rd of May 1798, the largest popular Republican Irish right uprising began. Across the island, tens of thousands fought under the banner of the United Irishmen. Hundreds of thousands have been sworn into the organization in preceding 4 years. In 4 occasional revolutionary French sent thousands of troops to aid the rebellion. The United Irishmen have built contacts with the revolutionary Republicans across the globe, including the USA, French, Hamburg, and England. The response of the British state to the rise of the United Irishmen was brutal counterinsurgency, campaign to soothe up sectarian conflict of the island. 1798 thus came to shape much of the political struggle that took place from the centuries. In 1898, a centenary was accompanied by mass mobilization. On 15 August 1898, 100,000 people gathered at the top of the Grafton Street in Dublin to take part in the dedication of the first stone of the statue of rebel leader Wolfe Tone. However, the centenary was used to write out the history of many of the radical elements of the rebellion, and people who commemorate revolutionary Irish republicanism was moving towards an increasing sectarian nationalism, which will remove British rule from 26 counties at the cost of commenting division between Catholic and Protestant workers. By the centenary of 1998, by coinciding with the peace process, attracted considerable discouragement from the formation of local history groups, the holding of conferences and large-scale interests, at least in the South. In the TV, documentaries, and books published about the event, discovering the legacy of the 1798 and the way to use to shape both history of the idea of Irish nation may be part of the process of becoming a sectarian division and building a new radical mass political party. A quick summary of the rebellion. The foundation of the Belfast and Dublin Society in the United Irishmen took place in the autumn of 1791. The initial reforms organization demanded democratic reform, including Catholic emancipation. In response to the popular pressure, the British government were effectively ruled Ireland initially granted some reform. This period of reform ended in 1793 when the war broke out between revolutionary French and Britain. The United Irishmen journey to revolutionary separatism was only completed after the Cave Hill Oath of June of 1795, where above the town of Belfast, some of the leadership, including Thomas Russell, Wolfe Tone, Harry Joy McCracken, and Samuel Neilson, swore never to desist in our effort until we had subverted the authority of England over the country and assert her independence. From this time on, their program was for a revolution that, with France backing, would break the connection with Britain and usher democratic reform. What seemed remarkable today is all these men had gave birth to revolutionary Irish republicanism were Protestants. In December of 1796, the United Irishmen came the nearest they would for victory when 15,000 French troops arrived off of Bantry Bay. Only the bad weather and poor seamanship of the Jacobin sailor prevented the landing and saved Britain from an almost certain defeat. In the British panic after Bantry Bay, Irish society became increasingly bitterly polarized as loyalists flocked to join the British Army and the United Irishmen numbers swelled massively. The British state launched a brutal counterinsurgency campaign to destroy the United Irishmen before the French could return. By the spring of 1798, the campaign of British terror was destroyed. The United Irishmen organization and many of the leaders had been arrested. The remaining leaders were forced to call an immediate rising before French aid would arrive. The date was set on 23rd of May, but a series of factors undermined the rising of Dublin. It just served to spark major rising in Wexford in the south and Antrim and Down in the north. These saw large-scale battles in which tens of thousands participated. Elsewhere, there were minor skirmishes, particularly around Dublin. After the defeat of the main rising, small French army landed on the west coast of Ireland and Killala on the August of 22nd. Although there was almost no revolutionary organization in the area, thousands flocked to join them, and the subsequent army succeeded in inflicting one major defeat of the British. By the autumn, the rebellion had been defeated, tens of thousands were dead, and a reign of terror spread over the country. The international context, the roots of the rebellion can be found in transatlantic democratic revolution that swept America and Europe at the end of the 18th century, the American Revolution of 1771 to 81, and the French Revolution of 1789 were key events which inspired the democratic revolutionary movement in Ireland. It was demand for radical democratic reforms rather than a misty-eyed nationalism that was the prime motivation for the United Irish movement. In the American Revolution, despite its deep flaw, it preserved and expanded slavery, was the first successful democratic revolution against monarchy and for republicanism. Even the U.S. were followed with keen interest, particularly among Presbyterians in the North, as there was scarcely a family in the north of Ireland which did not have relatives living in the colonies. Huge numbers emigrated to the previous decade, which served for the religious liberty, others to escape high rents, and some 250,000 Presbyterians emigrated to the U.S. from Ulster from 1717 to 1776. There were popular displays of support the American rebels throughout the North during the war with British Empire, until Irish leader John Caldwell described how on the news of the Battle of Bunker Hill, miners and Orled me to the top of the mount with Miss Mother Eve, where the young and the aged were assembled before blazing bonfire to celebrate what is considered the triumph of America over British despotism. The contemporary historian Dr. Camper described how the local Presbyterian heard with pride the commemorate the flower of Washington Army. While the French Revolution was seen to follow the extent of the promise of the American Revolution, it was more radical and sought a more direct involvement in the popular masses. Thibault Wolfton was later to be the United Irish leader of the last French expedition, described how the French Revolution became the test of every man's political creed. A nation was fairly divided into two great parties, the aristocracy and Democrats. In July 1791, Belfast Bastille commemoration of the declaration of the volunteers and inhabitants at large of the town and neighborhood of Belfast was distributed. For the Northern Presbyterian radicals, French offered hope to change at home. Samuel Barber, in his famous sermon as a moderator of General Synod in 1791, said of France that nation would not be the refuge and asylum of the brave and good in every nation. French were not just a need as a refuge, but also a sample in the world of the paper of the United Irishmen. Northern Star proved the people of every country that when they were oppressed, they were the power to address. The Northern Star went so far as to defend the execution of King Louis as the only mode of protection of internal tranquility. Importantly, as France was a Catholic country, the revolution there demonstrated the skeptical Northern Presbyterians that Catholics could act independently and against the teachings of their church. Wolfton asked them to look at France where its intolerance of popish bigotry now. Has not the Pope been burned in effigy in France? The previous reform movement had focused on lobbying in the aggregate Irish and British Parliament. With the French Revolution, a new strategy became apparent. On the mass of the people striking for change, several of the future rebellion leaders spent time in France in the early 1790s. John Charles attempted the execution of Louis and once waved his red handkerchief on the Daniel O'Connor's nose, saying it was stiff with the king's lifeblood. Edward Fingergall wrote to his mother from Paris that the energy of the people is beyond belief. I go a great deal to the assembly. In late 1792, these two, together with the American radical Republican Thomas Paine, discussed in some detail a plan to start a rebellion in Ireland. The British state recognized the importance that the French connection had in mobilization mass support behind the United Irishmen. Gerald Lake wrote in March 1797 that the lower order of people and most of the middle class are determined Republicans, and embodying the French principle, it would not be contented with any sort of a revolution. However, this close identification with the revolutionary French became a two-edged sword for the United Irishmen. In February of 1793, British declared war on revolutionary France. Forced to choose sides, many of the early middle-class membership of the United Irishmen deserted their ranks in an atmosphere of patriotism and propaganda. The presence of the French spy, William Jackson, became the excuse for the ready disbanding of the Dublin Society. In May of 1794, within the United Irishmen, some saw French influence as negative. Too much reliance came to place in French intervention rather than Irish self-organization. The United Irishmen James Holt described how before the rebellion, the majority of the leaders became foreign aided men who were easily elevated or depressed by the news from France among their rank spies were chiefly found. the rights of man, the identification with America or France was thrust sympathy with the political demand of the program of those revolutions. That was particularly the case in North, where popular support of United Irishmen were linked to the search of just and democratic society, a society in which all would be citizens rather than subjects. In the words of the 1700s, this was a demand that seemed as impossible as that for an anarchist society does today. The success of our American and French Revolution turned what previously would have been seen as an impossible dream of a few into a realistic program for the masses. The high demand for political literature and paper that were evident throughout the 1790s indicate the influence and spread of revolutionary ideas of the period. First among those was the two-part pamphlet The Rights of Man, written by Thomas Paine. This pamphlet started from defense of the revolution against the hereditary monarchy was unnatural and advocating a republic form of government. It was published in March 13, 1791 and July of 1791, and the Dublin Week Club has established a cheap edition for mass circulation. By late 1793, over 200,000 copies of Part 1 and 2 have been circulated in Britain and Ireland. Paine's persecution for sedition labeled by the British government only boosted its popularity, and one United Irishman, a later British agent, Leonard McNally, wrote in 1795, described how his work are in everyone's hands and in everyone's mouth. They had got into the schools and are in constant subject of conversation with the youth. Now, in the political context, Ireland of the 1790s was ruled by Anglican Church of England landowners and aristocrats. The mass of the population was not Anglican, and so even if they could accumulate wealth, they excluded from political power. Outside of Ulster and Dublin, they were overwhelmingly Catholic. Complex religious divide along the class and geographical line have been created by the British ruling class as a mechanism to divide and rule that include codified system of religious discrimination as a penal laws. Ulster was dominated by pre-Presbyterian dissenters who had moved from the previous centuries or were displaced of earlier Catholic population of the region. Some of this migration was of the aftermath wars with the London government created plantations, in particular after the fight of the Earls in 1607, when the old Catholic Gaelic ruling class had fled to France and Spain. Most alive in later waves of migration, particularly in the wave of Scottish immigration, which took place in 1790s, when tens of thousands fled a famine in the borders region of Scotland. The previous 150 years in Ireland have been marked by two vicious wars where combatants were mobilized along religious lines, with Catholics and Protestants, including Presbyterians, on opposing sides. Each side of these wars claimed religious motivation, and religious divide led to various sectarian massacres. This period of massacre and continued massacre created the sectarian politics that had dominated Ireland since. The penal laws were designed to draw a religious barrier between landlord classes, which would be stricken to Anglicans, and the Catholic/Presbyterian peasantry. Catholic landlords would remain their land, but only at the price of converting. Between 1703 and 1788, some 5,000 Catholic land-owning families became Anglican. In addition, by becoming agents of absentee landlords, many of the Catholic gentry went underground. It's calculated that if one includes convert estates, the figure for Catholic ownership of land reached about 20%. In addition to breaking up Catholic-owned estates, the penal law also ruled that no prelate was allowed to reside in Ireland under the penalty of being hanged, drawn, and quartered. No Catholics served in the armed forces or possessed arms. No ride a horse worth more than £5. They could not vote or be a member of a parliament or citizen of an incorporated town. In short, even if Catholics would require wealth, they would still exclude from any participant in decision making. The penal law also banned mass and education. The Presbyterians were subject to similar laws. A Test Act excluded them from local government. In 1713, Westminster Act made Presbyterian school teachers liable to 3 months of imprisonment, and Presbyterian aggregate marriage was also made illegal. As late as 1771, 4 Presbyterians were arrested for holding a prayer meeting in Belderberg, so-called democratic politics in Britain. At the time, excluded all but rich men from elected MPs. Rotted brothels where the MP would be elected by a handful of voters were not uncommon, but in Ireland the situation was far worse, according to the letter of the United Irishmen sent to the English Society of the Friends of the People. By 1793, the laws discriminating against Presbyterians are largely being abolished, in part to head off revolt, in part to halve the loss of labor through migration, and worst of the penal laws against Catholics has also been abolished. However, as the above quote, as I mentioned earlier, Ireland was still ruled by a tiny minority of wealthy Anglicans. Now, in the origins of the Orange Order, if the history of religious wars in 16th, 17th century and the inequality still present in the 1790s led to a sectarianism in the general population. But the period of the 1780s was one was remarkable for the fact that this sectarian tension temporarily retreated into background. Armagh was a major exception to this, where the population was heavily divided between Anglicans, Presbyterians, and Catholics. Under the penal laws, Catholics were not allowed to have arms, so but some of the more radical volunteers company had been recruited and army Catholics. In 1780s, Protestant loyal forces started raising Catholic homes, searching for arms. They were known as the P.O. Day Boys. In 1795, one such raid at Diamond near Dummy saw many Catholics killed. It was the aftermath of this clash that the Orange Order was formed. It was the interest of both the Irish landlord class and the British government to promote sectarian conflict. As the Anglican Archbishop of Armagh pointed out to the land struggle in the 1780s, and I quote, "The worst of it is that it stands to unite Protestant and Papists, where the happiest goodbye to the English interests in Ireland." End quote. Central to understanding the motivation for many of the rebels in 1798 rising were conditions for the peasantry. For most part, they had no rights, were treated as animals, or completely alienated from the landlord class. In 1831, there were 1,500 absentee landlords living outside Ireland who owned 3,200,000 acres, and 44,500 absentee owners living in Dublin and owning 4.2 million acres. There were famines in 1740, 1757, 1765, and 1770. Four cities killed 400,000 people. Around another source of restatement was tithes. Everyone, regardless of their religion, were required to pay tithe to the local Anglican clergy. These payments were often the center of agrarian struggle. In this period, working class was also starting to develop and assert itself. Even apparently rural areas were at least somewhat dependent on the manufacture for part of their income. The United Irishman organization in the north outside Belfast was to be focused in the Linden Triangle. There were at least 27 labor disputes in Dublin from 1717 to 1800, and the formation of the early trade unions had started. There were 50 combinations and 27 different trades in Dublin, and between 1772 to 95, there were at least 30 food riots in the period 1772 to 94. And by the way, the first successful attempt of an independent Ireland was during the early 1910-1920. It was at the anarchist society at the beginning, a very small town that successfully got their independence until Irish at the loyalists and British crushed them. Irish history will no longer simply be a conflict over religion, those who will be ruled. Previous rebellions had concentrated winning back to the land of the old Catholic gentry, but by 1798, in addition to families who converted in order to maintain their lands, many other Catholic gentry families had become middlemen who subrented to smaller tenants. And these families were frequently in discussion outside from the peasantry, but especially remote area or the estate by absentee landlord, where these old families retained effective cultural control of their communities. By 1760s, as capitalists had begun to penetrate Irish agriculture and enclosure began to create middlemen, the fast landlordly social bond that held this disposition Catholic gentry to the peasantry began to break. Catholic as well as Protestant landlords and middlemen became targets of various agrarian secret societies. The complete absence of democratic rights made it impossible for ordinary people to organize in any popular manner. By the harsh repression, peasants lived under general resistance. Peasants organized throughout the 18th century through secret underground societies. Their members would often operate at night and in disguises, taking direct and often violent action against local oppressors. In the 1760s, one such society was the Oak Boys, particularly strong in counties of Monaghan and Armagh and Tyrone, and mainly organized against the system of compulsory and unpaid road repairing. In 1762, the White Boys, an anti-closure movement involving poor Protestant Catholics, were active. The Steel Boys in the 1770s were one of the most powerful, and they organized the counties of Down and Antrim, were the most part Presbyterian. The fight for the abolition or reduction of tithes were also against the enclosure of common land. These societies at times conducted mass public mobilizations. James Connolly noted the Steel Boys that in the year 1772, 6 of their number were arrested and lodged in the town jail of Belfast. Their associates immediately mustered in thousands, and an open day march upon the city made themselves masters, therefore stormed in jail and released their comrades. This suggests elements of organization and federation beyond the local level. The defenders were organized nationally in the lodges. The British Viceroy Camlet claimed they meet in bodies of several hundreds and some occasions 3,000 or 4,000 had assembled. In the formation of the United Irishmen from the early 1790s, British state was becoming increasingly wary of the way the Northern Presbytery was seeking to overcome sectarian divisions. Viceroy Westmoreland wrote in 26th of July 1791 that the language of sentiment the dissenters united with the Catholics and their union would be formidable. This fear was well founded. Already several of the most radical figures of the volunteers, the Whig clause, and the supporters of the Catholic emancipation were engaged in discussing. The Belfast United Irish formed with 36 members, and the Toffler Society was founded as well. 2 days later, the Home Secretary Grenville observed the United Irish call for the Irishmen to unite regardless of religion. There is no evil that I will not prophesy if the union takes place. Although many of the United Irishmen started off as reformers looking for an equal relationship with Britain, there's significant difference from earlier movement. Instead of lobbying the Irish ascendancy or British Parliament for reform, they aimed for mass mobilization of the population. They also attached no limitations on Catholic emancipation, openly looking for a future where all men would be equal citizens. To understand the class basis of it, in each shown from the same circle as the volunteers, Protestant middle class, in particular legal profession. Nancy Curtis' study of the class composition of the early Irishmen before 1794 showed that 70% of them were merchants, and only 20% of them were artisans, clerks, and laborers. While a committee of 21 tribes political programs, they rejected a property qualification in order for men to vote, but this almost split the committee down to middle and was carried only by a vote of 11 to 9. There was a class conflict at the core of the United Irish ideology, but it was not the class conflict between worker and capitalist, that we speak today. The conflict in leadership was based on roles between the industry and the aristocracy. Many were even hostile to the developing union movement through Thomas Russell, defending the journeyman waivers in industrial dispute with local line merchants and the Northern Star, applauded the defeat of anti-combination bill of the House of Lords. For their time, however, the United Irishmen were in the vanguard of European radicalism. The Dublin Plan of Reform program included 300 electoral division, a vote for all men over 21, represented to be over 25, but not required to own property, all represented to be paid in annual election. This represents a radical program, even in comparison with the wave of European resolution in 1848. Some 50 years later, it would be well over 100 years before suffrage at this level became common in Europe. The United Irishmen were Republicans, but at the time this was a very ambiguous term. As John Adams put it, the Republican may simply anything or nothing. The Northern Star summarized the United Irishmen stood for proclaiming liberty of freedom, considering having an actual share in the appointing of those who framed the laws and who are to be guardians of elderly men's life, property, and peace. But because of the United Irishmen bigotry against the Catholic who committed death squads against them, just like how right-wing led American death squad happened in the 1970s and 80s. By December 1796, a French fleet appeared ashore at Bantry Bay, 15,000 French soldiers and Wolfton. Rough seas and experienced sailors prevented landing that would have a good chance of liberating the country from British rule. The British campaign of terror against the United Irishmen over the next 2 years was surely undermining the organization. By 1798, the spring of 1798 pressured the mountain of a rising. The key of the rising was to Dublin, was intended to see the city of trigger a mass siege to the rest of the country by stopping the mail coaches. Their non-arrival would be signal for local rebellion. However, although thousands turned out the rising Dublin, it ended up as a fiasco with almost no fighting. The reason why this happened, why there was no significant rising in Belfast, can be found in the class base of the leadership. While it was clear that the rising was going to happen without the French, it was clear there was no mechanism to hold back the workers and peasants from going beyond the bourgeois democratic and separatist aims of the bulk of the leadership. The French Revolution showed that the particularity of the city, the monks were capable of creating their own demands, intending to implement them even if they went beyond the wishes of the leadership. Edward Fingerfeld, Nielsen, and others who planned May 21st rising that were ready to risk this, but they were arrested as removed from the command. The British on the informational informers were seized Smithfield Square, which was the gathering point for rising to confusion that was thus little chance of the rank and file. The United Irishmen spontaneously gathered to create an alternative plan. The second Reagan leadership, which had created an alternative plan, failed to do precisely because it feared the uncontrollable mob. From the British side, General Carhampton expressed this as feared. Precisely had been warned when people came forward, the aristocracy fearful of being left behind, insinuate themselves into our ranks, and rise into timid leadership of treacherous auxiliaries. In the Westford Republic, a merry rising happened, just enough in the fact to encourage the loyalists and British forces to unleash further terror to the rest of the country. In Westcote and North Wexford, this included the execution of over 50 United Irish prisoners, the attacking civilians and the burning of cabins. Although Wexford had over 300 Irishmen, to bulk them do not appear to have been prepared for an uprising, and would probably have been against one for the reason online. The history of the rebellion takes its state without the French landing and without the compulsory appliance of the magistrate and their agents, there would have been no Wexford rising at all. And this account demonstrates the early battles were spontaneous clashes in the only important victory of the outlet in the 17th of May. There was no real command, and some of the United Irishmen were armed only with stone. There, in part due to the very poor militia tactic and successful ambush, the rebels wiped out the detachment of the Cork militia. The victory demonstrated even well-armed and organized British forces could be defeated. This victory and the increased brutal counterinsurgency campaign saw hundreds and tens of thousands flock to join the rebel hilltop encampment. A second successful ambush for the militia included the capture of the artillery, interleading the capture in Wexford town. The town of Enniscorthy was also taken. Eventually, the superior tactics, arm, and training of the British forces was to be proven a match for the rebels, except with the British army was ambushed and heavily outnumbered. The rebels captured Buncloy, but the lack of discipline led to the looting and the confusion of the British army counterattacked and retook the town. The rebellion suffered its most decisive defeat after the Battle of New Ross, with 10% of the rebels were killed and the battle or massacre in the aftermath. The Wexford at the rebels' major attempt to spread the rebellion to neighboring counties failed at the Battle of Arkenouth. The rebel army was increased, demoralized, and restricted to defensive battles and guerrilla raids. The final major battle was fought in Vinegar Hill, after which the remaining rebels broke into small parties, some of which carried out guerrilla attacks for 3 more years. It has taken some 20,000 British soldiers almost a month to crush the 30,000 rebels who, utterly untrained, practically leaderless, and miserably armed. Wexford town had however been liberated for a short while. At the time it was thriving and had a population of 10,000, many of whom were Protestants. After liberation, a 7-man directory of the main United Irishmen and the 500-strong Senate took over the running of the town, but these include Catholic and Protestant members. In addition, the district had its own local committee, militia, and elected leader. The 3 weeks before it was retaken did not allow time for the construction activity beyond printing